once again to our e-commerce 0 to production in like backend. So for this video, right, we are going to be discussing about the database connection and our logger system that we are going to be using to log in the entire application instead of having like console.log everywhere. Like we need to have a logger system where we can actually set levels. But before we do that, we need to set up our Swagger documentation, and to set that up, and before we go back into setting it up, back into our code base, I've replicated what we had for cards, where we have our DTO repositories, schemas, controller module and service. We have that for orders too, as we can see. Oh, this is a wrong name. Let me update it. That's one of the bugs that would happen over time. So we have for orders, we have for products, DTO, repositories, schemas. We also have for users, where we have repositories, schemas, and yeah. So I think okay. So for now, and like I said, let's set up our Swagger documentation. So we have to create like a .env, and we would need to like set our node environment, create a variable for that. We have development here. We have our ports. Let's use port 3000, or let me use 3003. You can use whatever you want actually. So let's set up our Swagger enabled. We need like this. The reason why we want to do Swagger enabled is that, let's say you're actually building this for a production use case, right? You can have like a UAT environment or staging environment, and you can have a production environment. Normally, you would want to ensure Swagger documentation is enabled for your UAT or Swagger or staging environment. But for your production environment, you would actually want, for security purposes, you would want to have it disabled. So Swagger enabled true, and let's also okay, leave that for now. So, and we would need to set up Swagger in our main.cs. Let's go to our main.cs. In this, I'll say let's collapse this, and let's go to our main.cs. Inside Bootstrap, we are going to have config, and we would have to implement or import some things on the top here. Import nest factory. Okay, this gives us that. Let's we already have this. Sorry, we have to import reflect metadata. We have to import validation pipe from NestJS common. Yes, let's accept that. Import config service. From @NestJS config @NestJS config. Yes. Okay. So we would also need to have our document builder from NestJS Swagger. Import document builder. and also Swagger module. Swagger module, yes, from at NestJS Swagger. Do we have it here? Interesting. So while we have that, we can then come here and say if config.get, yes, string we have this, yes, config.get string Swagger enabled from our environment. Is not equal to false. Yes, then we then have to configure Swagger. This has to be closed here. And before we get to that, I think we have to define our config here. And const config is equal to, and before we even do that, we have to define our app. Const app is equal to what? And before we define our app, right, we have to import our app module. Import app module. This has to be in curly braces. From .app the module, yes, we are going to get there. So we would need to go to our app module. We need to have our app module set up. So this is our app module. We have to also import, let's copy this from here so we don't have to retype that. Import config, but here now it's going to be config module. Yeah. Okay. So we are adding this. I think these are errors. Okay. I didn't add this. We have to add this. And before we get back to fixing that bug, we have to come here and say at module, yes, then we can have this, say import, yes, import this. We then have our config module, yes, dot for, you can only know this, like, let's say when you go through the documentation of these packages, but let's proceed with this. Then is global, is true, yes, and we have this. So these are where we are going to define other modules. So add other modules later. Okay, then we then say, okay, we are going to add our health controller here. Health controller eventually, yeah. Here. But for now, it is not needed. So then we then say export our class app module, then have this. Okay, so this should, resolve this for us, and in our main.ts we can then proceed to define our await table. Await nest factory. I think we have nest factory. Yes, nest factory dot create, then app module. Yes, then we say buffer logs is what? True. From this now we then create our config.app.get. Yes, I think that is our config service, right? Config service. Okay, so since we have that resolved, we can then go back to setting our Swagger config. We can now say const Swagger config. Swagger config is what? Our new document builder, and proceed dot set title. We have to set title. Yes, and our title is what? Our e-commerce API. E-commerce API. Then what else? Dot set description. Set description. We have that as our NestJS. NestJS and TypeScript. TypeScript 0 to production series. So what else? We have to set our version of our API. The set version. Cool. Then that is 1.0. What else? We are going to eventually add bearer auth, or should we add it now? Let's proceed to add bearer auth. Yes. Then we then say, okay, build this for us in an interesting way. So we then say our documents, const documents is Swagger module dot create documents, then our app and our Swagger config. Yes. Then we had our semicolon here, and we say our Swagger module dot setup, the part in which we want it, dot setup. Let's have it in our API docs. Yes. Then the app, then the document. Okay. So since we already have the port, right, we then also define our port. Const ports. Let's tell it to try to pick it from our environment is config.get. No, I didn't send you to autocomplete. Config.get. Then you have to get a number here now, not a string. Number, which is port from our environment, or just default to, like, I want to use 3003 in this instance now. So we then tell our app to listen on that port. Await app.listen on that particular port. Okay. So let's try to start our application and see if it starts. Okay, so let's confirm that we have our Swagger docs. We then do localhost 3003. Okay, let's now go to our API docs to see if that is there. And as you can see, we have our API docs, but it is empty because we do not have any router endpoints yet. So we would now proceed to setting up our database connection and logger. So we need to for this series, right? We are going to be using Postgres, but we are going to make it easily switchable from Postgres. We are going to be using MongoDB. Sorry, MongoDB once again. We've seen how to create our MongoDB and how to pick our connection string for MongoDB from in our previous videos. So we'll be using MongoDB by default, but we want to make our app support Postgres eventually. So let's have our DB type to default to Mongo. Then we have what? Our MongoDB URI. URI, which is equal to, let me get my MongoDB URI from here. Connect new, get my MongoDB URI. Let's proceed. Okay. So we then, since we have this, we then have to like go to our database setup here and say for our database factory, we have to like put export type is DB type, which is Mongo by default, but or let's say Mongo or Postgres. Yes, so the type of our database should be either Mongo or Postgres. So we then have to export function for any of the export function, then get DB type, Yes, this factory again is for us to switch between Mongo and Postgres for later videos. So DB type, then we have this const DB type is equal to what? Process dot env dot what? Our DB type and default to what? Default to Mongo, yeah, as DB type. So then we have to proceed. Yes. So we have to proceed to say if, right? I think this is, do we have this? Neither undefined. Export type, DB type, we already have it. Okay, so if yes, this would be in case whereby you see something like this, you have to read, you can read through this highlighted to say function whose declared type is neither or defined void must return a value, right? We would see it fixed the moment we can return our DB type when we are done. So DB type is not equals to Mongo, yes, and DB type not equals to what? Postgres. Then what happens then? We do what? We throw an error, or we throw a new error and say this is an unsupported database type. Unsupported DB type. Then we have this, and we had it in here as the DB type. Set DB type is equal to Mongo for now. Okay, so right here we add a semicolon here, and we let it return what? Our DB type. So this error should be fixed. So after we are done with database factory, we then have to go to our module to set up our database. Database module, we have to import, import config module, and also config service. From, this is wrong actually. This is already imported. So import Mongo module, Mongoose module from at NestJS Mongoose. Yes, we have this. And do I have my, okay, this has to be added here. So then we then have to do at module. So we then define our Mongoose module. No, we have to specify our imports. Then from here we can define our Mongoose module. Dot for root async. Our async database. Then we do this, and we then say import what? Our config module. Then our config service, or no, inject, sorry. We have to inject our config service in there. This is wrong. So we inject our config service. We then specify it to use our database factory, or our config factory rather. Use factory is what? Config, which is our config service. Our config service, and have it, then take our database URI, which is what? Our config.get, get a string in this instance, which is our MongoDB URI. Our MongoDB URI. Then we can say define our server selection timeout. Millisecond, which should be like, let's say 5,000, and we then have to proceed, add a comma here, and add one here. So add one here. Then we then have to export this. Export our what? Our database module. Okay, so for our database factory, right, we import our config module, then we inject our config service in there. We use the factory, our config service factory, then we get our MongoDB URI and we set our server timeout. So we then have to set up our logger, like I said. So we have to add utils to our SRC. We need to add an utils layer. Utils. Okay, do we already have an utils? Oh yeah. So we have an utils. So I have to create logger, a logger layer for this logger. We would also need like a, how would I call it, a guards layer, which we would eventually speak about. But inside logger for now, we would need logger.config.ts, config.ts. We would need logger.module.ts. .cs, and we would also need logger.service.cs. Okay, so in logger.config.ts we are going to import all from Winston or as Winston. Then from our Winston package, so we then export our create Winston function, create Winston config, create Winston config. We have our node.env, which is supposed to be a string. We then have our log level, which should be a string. So let's take some context to understand why we need to have this. Where is our board? Okay, so let's discuss about log levels. So in most cases we have 4 different kind of log levels. We have debug, which is mostly everything you want to see. We have our info, we have our warning, we also have our error. So the reason why we need to, in a lot of production environments, we need to make our log levels, define our log levels, is that, let's say over the course of building our application, we define, like, let's say logger.debug. I want to see some things on the terminal as my application runs, and I say, okay, for this thing I want to log, I want to do logger.info to see that this is an information that I want to see as my application is running. And let's say when something happen out of the blue, and let's say some places I say, this thing that I'm about to log should be a warning. And let's say for when we are catching exceptions and error, we say we want to log them as errors. So what does that mean? It means that when doing development in my application, I can either set it to debug or info, which means I can, for everything happening in my application, I can see debugging and information logs in real time along with warning and error. But in a lot of cases in production environment, right, we don't want to see all these things in some cases. So we then say, either I set my how would I call it, my login level to warning. So what does that mean? It means I would only see in production, I would only see errors and warn logs. I won't see information and debug, which makes my logs cleaner. And if I set it to error, I would only see error logs at that instance. So let's proceed back to our code base, and let's say this is Winston dot logger options, and let's open this. Const is production is equal to when node env is equals production. Then we have to return level is what? Log level or default to info. Then our format is production. Then we have to do Winston format, the combine Winston the format. Ensure we have the timestamp in our log, timestamp. And we then say Winston the format .json. Then we say Winston the format combine dot Winston the format dot timestamp. We then specify our format for the timestamp. The format should be h, then minutes, then second. Yes. Then we say Winston dot format dot colorize. We then say Winston dot format dot printf. Yes. Then we have timestamp, then level, then message, our login message, then context, then we bring this as is equals or thinking about this. Okay, let's proceed to say consts. The context is context, then okay, context, then we have this and this. Then we return our timestamp. Return our timestamp level. Yes. Then our context, then our message. Okay. So we had a comma here. Then we then say transport the new Winston dot transport dot console. Okay, so we now have logger set up for our config. We then have to go to our module. Oh, this should be in config, not service. I thought I was in config. That's our logger config. Then we go to our logger module, import global module from at NestJS common, then import. Before we even get to our module, let's have our service set up. This is our injectable wrapper around Winston. So import injectable and logger service and what? Or yes, as nest logger service from NestJS common. We also have import as Winston from Winston. Then we also have import create Winston config from our logger config. So we then have our @injectable, and we have this as export class logger service, which implements our nest logger service. Then we have this as private read-only, which is our logger, which is our Winston logger, Winston.logger. Okay. So we then have to create like a constructor. Then say const node.env is what? Process dot env dot node.env, which we defined, or defaults to what? Development. Yes. So we need to also get our log level. So let's copy this. Let's copy this. That is our log level. So for this, we instead have our log level. Okay, so we then say our this.logger, which is equal to Winston dot create logger, then create Winston config, which we are sending in our node.env, and our what log level. So we have that, and we then have to define our log what message string context is also string. Then we have this dot logger dot info. Then we pass in our message and our context. Okay, then we have this. So we then have to define for error. For error, we take in, aside from message context, we also take in the trace, which is also a string. Yes, then we take in the message, context, and also the trace, yes, of that error. So after that, we then define one. For one, we also take in the message and the string this dot info dot, this should be dot error, sorry. This should be dot one. Then what else? We then have to do debug and verbose. Debug should have this dot logger dot debug and just the message and the context. Then we have verbose. Verbose also takes in the message and the context, and this is dot verbose. So that is pretty much it. So more like we kind of inherited the, how would I call it, the logger service from NestJS Common, and we improved it to our use case, or we modified it rather for our own use case. So like I said, we now have to go to our logger module, where we now do our import our logger service from interesting. So let's just have this here. Did I also have this? How about this? Okay, proceed. So we then do at global. Yes, no, that should not be. At global. Then we say at module. We made that module global. We now say providers, yes, is what our logger service, and do what imports exports what our logger service, yes. Then we now say export this class as our logger module, and we have this exactly. So just in preparation for us using it, we can, okay, before we even get there, so we now have our database and logger setup. Like I said, if we set our log level to error, we only see errors only in production, which is critical. Winston enforces this automatically. So if we set our logger level to 1, we would see our error logs and warning logs. When we set our logger level to information, we are going to see error, warning, and information. And when we set our logger level to debug, we are going to see everything. So we have our Atlas or Mongoose Mongo database setup. And for our next video, we are going to be going into our domain layer and our user schema. If this project reminds you of anything, of any previous projects or what you are currently working on, or if you have any concerns, hit the comment section and comment on it. We are going to respond as soon as possible. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share our videos.